This is episode 263 of the Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts podcast. This episode is titled Book Bans and the PEN America Lawsuit. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts. I'm your host, Jennifer Crittenden. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by Discreet Guide, the training company for improving your speaking and writing skills. Thank you for joining us, and tune in on Mondays for new episodes. I'm so delighted to welcome a new guest to the show today. Casey Meehan is with us, and Casey is from PEN America to join us today to talk about book banning and book bans and some legal issues around that as well. So welcome to the show, Casey.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for having me.
Casey is the Freedom to Read Program Director at PEN America, leading our initiatives to protect the right of students to freely access literature in schools. And previously, Casey served as the Associate Director of Post-Secondary Policy at a mission-driven education research organization in Philadelphia, which is called Research for Action. Casey's research centers students, educators, and school leaders' experiences in identifying strategies for reform and capturing emerging best practices, and strives to connect research to policy and program change. Casey holds a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and an MPA from the Fels Institute at the University of Pennsylvania, along with a certificate in politics. All right, Casey, let's jump right in. My first question is a humdinger. Can you bring us up to speed with what is happening with book banning? What form is it taking? And what does it mean when somebody says this book has been banned? Is the government banning the book, a school board, a PTA group? What is this whole thing all about?
Right. Let's we can jump right to the meat of it. And I will do my best to succinctly answer this question. And then there's more resources that I'll share with you that we could post for your listeners that can go a bit deeper. But PEN America has tracked for the last now 2.5 years an undeniable and unprecedented attack on free expression in public education. And what we have been able to record is a mounting crisis of book bans. So from July 2021 through June 2023, which is where our most recent data update takes us, but then we sort of have anecdotal evidence, from June to today. But in that period, 2021 to 2023, over 2 school years, we have recorded almost 6,000 instances of book bans occurring across 41 states and 247 school districts. So it's just an immense mounting crisis, as I shared. And we record a book ban a few ways. So when we say a book has been banned, at its essence, the simplest definition is that a book has been removed from access. So a book that was previously available to a student is no longer available. And this may mean that a book has been removed for a prolonged period of time while it undergoes a review, and then potentially that book may make its way back. But we've seen these review processes take months, even years. So this is a really long time that students are lacking access to that particular book. This could also be an instance where a book that was previously available for elementary school students has been moved to a restricted, high school only library. So where a book had previously been accessible to, your 7th and 8th graders, now that book is only available to high school students. So we also count that as a book ban. And then there are also instances where books have just been full stop removed from the district. From any classroom or library shelf across the school district, books are being decidedly removed from access and not brought back under any means.
And so just to clarify, because this was sort of an aha for me yesterday, if I have this right, when we describe a book as being banned, what that means is the book had already gone through a vetting process with a librarian or a teacher, and they had determined that the book was appropriate for that age level, that library, that school library. But now there's an intervening force that comes in after that process and says, no, you're wrong. This book isn't appropriate for this space. Is that right, Casey?
That's really well said. That's exactly right. And which often, we point to, I am not a trained librarian. I've been a college adjunct educator, but I'm not a trained like K-12 educator either. So these are folks that are professionally trained, and books come in through, like real thoughtful selection processes. It's unlikely that a book is just kind of appearing on the shelf without somebody, vetting that book and making the decision that this book is developmentally appropriate or interesting to students or reinforces, this year's like history curricula. So there's lots of ways that books come onto shelves, but you're absolutely right that professionally trained educators and librarians have already, sort of made those decisions and are best positioned to adjudicate what is, coming onto shelves. And that there are other pressures being applied that are taking the books off shelves outside of kind of that selection process from educators and librarians.
And then when we say the book has been banned, again, who is doing the banning?
Yeah, our research points to two like primary pressures behind book bans. The first is kind of like local, very localized pressures. So it could be a parent of a student in the district. It could be a community resident. It could be somebody who's affiliated with a group that has been, mobilizing nationwide to see certain books removed from classroom shelves. That pressure, that very like local group or individual pressure plays out by having one individual challenging a book, or what we see more commonly is challenging tens to 20s to hundreds of books at a given school district for removal. So that's one place where we see book bans, kind of originating from. They're initiating from a challenge on a specific book being sent to the district from an individual actor or somebody who's affiliated with a group. And those groups are groups that many of us are now, familiar with. Moms for Liberty is an example of one of these groups. No Left Turn for Education is another. Citizens Defending Freedom is another group. So there's lots of groups with different titles and different names. But ultimately, they kind of have like an organized infrastructure to have their members or individuals affiliated with these groups go and challenge books at a nearby school district. So that's one big pressure. And then increasingly, we've been tracking the role that legislation is having in book bans. So that's our second pressure that we point to. There are several states that have now enacted pieces of legislation that are influencing, or kind of pressuring decision makers at the school district level to be removing books. Often we're seeing books removed kind of like out of fear that they may not be under compliance with a given piece of legislation. In other places, there is explicit language in legislation that is, sort of barring materials that discuss sexual orientation and gender identity. So then we see the way in which books that include, representations of LGBTQ plus individuals are increasingly pulled from shelves under these pieces of legislation. So pressures both kind of at the, state level from legislation, but also a very localized individual or group effort. And often you can imagine like there are states where these two forces converge, where we have legislation and then we also have localized pressures. And that's kind of like, where we see these like real surging instances of book bans.
Okay, I think what's interesting also, and you've alluded to this, but give us a sense of this if you can in some numbers, is just such a dramatic change since 2020, 2021. And actually, I think in one of your reports, you mentioned this is really unfortunate. It comes right after the pandemic lockdown when students already were suffering from, I guess I would call it a lack of education access during that time. So can you, give us some idea of how this has amped up really since the pandemic?
There's a librarian who has kind of been at the forefront of pushing back against book bans, Martha Hickson, and she is a 16 plus year librarian, and she always she can point to, and I've heard her in a few places point to the day she got her first challenge in 2021. So you can imagine there are many librarians and many schools that never saw a book challenge, or maybe had these one-off cases where a parent would catch their student reading something that parent, maybe wasn't comfortable with, and then would bring that challenge forward and have, conversations, but it would kind of just be over this one book. What we are seeing just in terms of scale and magnitude really does come on the heels of the pandemic, absolutely, and really kicks off in 2021. And, I think they're related. Like, I think I think public schools were really strained during the pandemic and, efforts and, tension points around whether to mask or whether to close, a lot of the individuals that had kind of like strong reactions to the pandemic have also shown up in the book banning movement as well. So it definitely kind of has grown out of, a lot of pressure, a lot of mistrust, and a lot of, I don't know, frustration, I guess, over like public school institutions that's continuing to manifest itself from the pandemic now in threats against students' free expression. So book banning being one, but we also have been tracking, other ways that free expression and just kind of like the operations of public school systems have been really, strained and tested over the last few years.
It's really interesting. I was thinking as you were talking, people seem so irritated and frustrated, right? There's sort of a lot of lashing out about various things, politics or driving or, just I see it in my neighborhood, people just irritated and just lashing out. It's so interesting, though, that those general malaise manifests itself sometimes in something so specific as this particular book in this particular library, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's funny how sort of becomes laser focused on one thing that maybe doesn't merit such an outcry, but it's a symptom of this general aggravation. Yeah, it's kind of funny.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think book bans have become, I often like point to book bans as like they're bellwether, right? But there's something that's like so tangible that we can all understand like what it means to remove access to a book. And we, I think a lot of people also, I guess on different, different ends of it, but we can all like remember reading books and wanting to access books and going to book fairs in elementary school and high school. So the idea that, these things that we all had and all did are now being like questioned and challenged. I don't know, there's something like both bellwether and sensational and absurd rolled into one.
Our modern life, right? Yeah,
Something like
exactly.
that. Yeah.
This era we're living in. And then again, big picture question for you. What kinds of books have been banned historically, and what kinds of books are being banned now? Do you have some specific examples?
Yeah, actually, maybe I'll share this with you and we could find somewhere to post it online. But PEN America actually has like I don't know, I don't know what the right word is, but an interesting blog that looks at kind of the history of literary censorship. And in that blog, we go back to 1601, where Shakespeare's works were censored and suppressed, all the way to 1637, which would be like the first kind of American book banning case of Thomas Morton's The New English Canon. That you'll often hear folks who are in the book banning space like as old as America, right? Like we have always had instances of book banning. There have always been, efforts to suppress and to censor certain types of literature, certain types of content, certain identities in our stories, certain histories. It's true to our history of the United States. We have even in kind of like more recent history, I mean, Judy Blume is an author whose works are contemporarily banned. So they've been banned over the last few years. And when you hear Judy Blume talk, she'll remind you that her books were challenged in the 70s and the 80s, forever being kind of like the first young adult novel to really talk about sex in a way that was, kind of like from the female experience. Like that book itself received a lot of, challenges and was certainly banned, before. And then, of course, we've seen it banned now. So anyway, of course, like the US has a long history of book bans and book banning. And in some ways they're the same and in some ways they're different. I think what we're seeing now are, again, books that there's challenges and bans against books that represent characters of color so that we can acknowledge that from other parts of our history as well. So books that include BIPOC characters or are written by authors of color are overwhelmingly banned and censored. Our research points to how books with LGBTQ plus characters or books that are written by LGBTQ plus authors are overwhelmingly banned and censored. Increasingly we see books that talk about sex in any way. So it could be sexuality, it could be sex experiences. We're increasingly seeing the way in which books that talk about sexual assault and violence against individuals, violence against women, sexual violence against women are banned as well. So Now, 2.5 years, we're seeing kind of a broadening of what is, in fact, being targeted, but certainly the undercurrents of this are, suppression of LGBTQ plus stories, suppression of stories that represent characters of color and individuals of color, and then any bans on books that talk about sex and sexual violence.
Well, one of the things I really like about Pen America is your focus on data. And often your reports are just incredible treasure troves of statistics and data. So the one that was released about the school year 2022 and 2023, in that one, Pen America reported that over 800 books had been banned. 30% were about race, 26% LGBTQ plus topics. But there are a lot more, and you alluded to that. It's interesting to me that a lot of the rest of them seem to be about violence. Now, would you characterize this violence in any particular way, or is it just gross violence, or is there some theme that's running through those?
We actually have a great report called Spineless Shelves that looks at the 2 years of the book banning movement and also puts a little bit of has one visual graphic that shows the way in which the subjects, the content of the books have shifted from year to year. So where this movement first started, with really targeted attacks on books by and about characters of color or authors of color, books about racism and race, books about LGBTQ plus characters. In the second year of this movement, we can, in some ways, we assume that many of those books are still off shelves, right? They can't actually be banned anymore because they've been removed. So they unfortunately don't show up as like continued trends. But what we see in the second year of this movement is, you're right, like this increase in challenging books that include themes or instances of violence, and also include health and well-being. And again, this is in sexual experiences. So those three kind of show up in year two differently. I think when we look at kind of that year two expansion, it's almost like we, internally, the team at Penn characterizes it as like things that just make people uncomfortable. Like it's hard to even, what is it about violence? Like, name a book that doesn't have either like violence, sex, some sort of romance. And, I don't know, there aren't that many pieces of literature, or even we have another category of themes of grief and death. I mean, that's like, these are kind of like anchored content areas in much of literature because it explains the human experience. And that's what makes books so compelling, is that they show us things and remind us of things and connect us with things. So yeah, so we always, we kind of say these are just content areas that make people uncomfortable. In terms of violence specifically, a big chunk of violence is sexual abuse and sexual violence, which is also interesting to me that there's such a, there's like this real discomfort about having access to those stories, and many of which you can imagine are, memoirs or stories of like specific people who have gone through, their own kind of sexual assault and abuse. So that's a big part of the violence category.
Yeah. And I think another thing to remember, at least when I start thinking a little bit more carefully about this topic, is when we decide as a parent that we're going to take an action to try and have a book removed from a school library, for example, what we're saying is not, I don't want my child reading this, right? Because as a parent, we're likely pretty much in control of that. Or really, if we can't control the kid from getting it from the school library, we're not going to be able to keep the kid from getting it from Amazon or the public library, right? But instead, what's really, trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who has this concern is, I don't want this book to be accessed by any child. And to me, that's a big difference, right? It's sort of moving you from a position of a parent concerned about your own kid to being a monitor of ideas. And it's not a very well formulated question, but I wonder if you, as you have thought about this so much more carefully than I have, like, what is that? What does that mean to do that?
Yeah, what is that? I like that question. We see this all the time. And often people who are making this argument about like, my parental rights, like, I need to be making decisions for my children. Like it gets slippy as soon as it's like, well, what about everybody else's children? And what about my parental rights? And, what if our parental rights are at odds with each other? Then like, who gets to, what makes you more of the authority to decide than myself as another parent? So I think that's exactly right. That this movement to ban books is not about, individual parents making decisions for their kids, but this is about individuals and groups making decisions that affect all students. And I think, more so too, what's happening is it's really putting a chilled environment over the entire school system. So we are watching how, in addition to books being banned from access for students, we're hearing over and over again that purchases from to school libraries, like new book purchases are suspended.
Oh,
Librarians are cautious about what books they're going to stock in the shelves, knowing that if they include, a book with this type of representation or these themes, that it'll likely be challenged and create, a whole set of obstacles. Educators are increasingly cautious about what they're delivering in their own classroom instruction out of fear of like somebody saying that their teachings are inappropriate or harmful to students. I think there's a real atmosphere, we call it like a chilled atmosphere that is rippling from this movement as well. So the implications are so vast that this isn't about, one parent providing safeguards for what their students reading. It's so much larger, and its implications are really affecting the entire school system, which is, again, which is like the most alarming part of this to watch.
I think that's right. I mean, it really does have a chilling effect. I attended a webinar put on by PEN America, actually, in conjunction with the Society for Children's Book Writers. Yeah,
Oh, so
yeah,
great. They have been
yeah.
such good sessions. I was on a few of them. Yeah.
The moderator for the panel, Laurent Lynn, he'd written a book about a queer teen growing up in Texas called, I think, Draw a Line, something like that. And he said in that webinar, he wanted to address a myth that we have that sometimes sales of a banned book will rise after it's been
Right.
banned. And sometimes there's sort of oh, this is good for the book. And Laurent was explaining it really is not, and that he could directly see the impact on the sales of his book, probably from other libraries, I'm guessing, that decided then not to stock his book because it had been banned. And also, I think this idea of chill is really a great word, but it extends all the way down to authors too, writers who are in some cases really quite motivated to sell their book, and they might decide to just alter their book a little bit so it just doesn't, raise that problem, raise that question, even in an editor's mind at a publisher. So this idea of chill, I think it's really effective. Actually, I think this is one of the scarier things, is just the sort of overriding sanitization of things that are available to us. I don't know if there's a way ever to try and measure that, but anecdotally, I feel as though I can see the effects of this.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up so many good and valid points. I mean, the one thing that we also call out in our most recent report is that once an author is banned in one place, it's almost like a copycat or like a scarlet letter effect, to draw on our literary background,
Mhm.
right? That they kind of, these authors are being branded, and then other districts are seeing these lists of books that are banned in one school district in Texas, and now a district in Missouri is removing the same set of books because, right, there's this fear that these books are including something, and that these books are going to get challenged, and these books are going to cost time and effort and energy on a school district. So that's absolutely right. Like the way in which kind of these lists are shared district to district, state to state, that have that have the same authors. And then that just means an author's work is being banned, in multiple districts. And that is real revenue for authors. And in addition to like many authors, particularly kidlit authors, maintain, kind of some of their income through visits to schools, school visits. And that's another area that has really been chilled by this movement. I mean, we have authors have shared that they've been asked to not talk about a certain book when their author visit because that book includes a queer character, or to not talk about another book because they discuss, segregation and racism in that book. Like again, it's just this atmosphere where folks are overly cautious, increasingly intimidated and fearful. But ultimately, the effects of that is a real suppression of speech.
Yeah, so I want to go into that a little bit more. This is an area that's particularly interesting to me, and work that PEN America, thank God for PEN America, really is such a good resource for me to go back and remind myself, okay, what kind of country are we? Why are we interested in freedom of expression in this country and so forth? So let's take a couple examples so that we can, explain this. When we're thinking about freedom of expression, let's take an example. Okay, so let's start with Laurent's book, Draw the Line. It's a YA novel about a gay teen who's growing up in a small town in Texas, and it's been banned. And as you say, once it's banned in one place, then other areas just look at the list and say, okay, yeah, we're going to ban all those also. And again, a lot of times this is done without actually reading the book. They're just pulling lists from someplace else. Okay, so with Laurent's book, and it's been banned, from a freedom of expression standpoint in the United States, why is that bad?
PEN America has been kind of like a unique voice in this moment because we do have a principled position on free expression. So, our principles in the United States also anchor back to First Amendment case law. And there's precedent in the United States that school library books are protected, that they have special protections, and that the removal of books from school libraries based on narrow ideological grounds, is unconstitutional or undemocratic. So in a case like Draw Your Line, where I'm going to throw some assumptions out here, but presumably though the book is being challenged because of its LGBTQ plus representation, and a decision to remove that book would be driven through a very narrow ideological viewpoint. That runs counter to principles of free expression and our First Amendment rights that we have in the United States. So that, I think that is at perhaps the highest level. I could give you many reasons why it's harmful in terms of, what that means in terms of students in schools who are looking for a resource that is representative, what it means for students who need to be exposed to books that introduce them to somebody who has a different lived experience. I mean, there's all that, more developmental and empathetic value of a book like Draw the Line too. So to remove that, also limits, students' access to diversity and to understanding, our pluralistic society and all the different identities and histories and lived experiences that exist.
Yeah, and I think that argument really resonates with people, right? It's like, children who are having those kinds of experiences personally, it could be very helpful to them to read a book like that and identify with somebody else's experiences. Okay, but that's not the whole story with freedom of expression, right? It's not always about empathy and caring for a
Right.
young person who's struggling to find themselves in some small town in Texas. So let's take another one. So let's pick a book that you and I would probably find pretty offensive. Suppose that there's a book out there that proposes quite seriously some race-based ideologies like segregation or eugenics. Pick something that you and I would find pretty offensive. And then some right-minded people decide that that book should not be available. That's a dangerous book, and we want to get rid of it. And we want to protect our children from that kind of wrong thinking. Okay, why is that bad?
I imagine probably many people and viewers would be, repulsed and put off by this type of content. But again, I think when we argue for free expression, we do argue for a very principled approach. And in some ways, maintaining that principled approach helps demonstrate that this is a universal principle, that we are looking to ensure that all individuals have access to what, PEN America will often use the term a global marketplace of ideas and the free exchange of opinions and viewpoints. And would I disagree with this book and its opinions and viewpoints, and likely, could probably find a lot of factual inaccuracies? Like, absolutely. But in terms of its access into a global marketplace, it's not like our principle is that folks should have access to this book. Let's say hypothetically this book finds its way into a school library or something like that. There must be ways to talk about and to approach, difficult viewpoints that run counter to how we currently see and feel the world. This is true with many, kind of literature that is a bit more, was written in the past
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
now has, when we look at it from a contemporary viewpoint, like appalling, right? But I think, what can it teach us? Again, in addition to like Penn maintaining this principled stance on marketplace, on ensuring access to a marketplace of ideas and this free exchange of information and opinions and stories, it goes on both sides. That our answer is not ban and to remove ideas that are harmful. We can't suppress ideas necessarily that are hateful, even though, sometimes at my core, I would like to. But the answer is not to, is not to silence, but is to, expose and engage
Hmm.
and to question and to have, challenging discourse around what's being presented. So again, I think where Penn can be unique here is really maintaining that principled stance.
I return to Pen America over and over to remind myself about, yeah, those types of things. Because it's easy to get confused, I think, as you start thinking about the suppression of ideas. But you make such a great point there, Casey, is that, a lot of these books are actually exposing our history. And when you start trying to suppress history, that sort of intuitively is easy for me to realize the danger in that. If you acknowledge what has been written before, or even what was part of the public discourse before, we realize both how far we've come and also how some of these issues still persist. But trying to remove that information is not helpful to an understanding. So I think this point that you make about history is very important. The whole thing about you're destined to repeat history if you don't study it.
Right. And it maintains true. And it feels, at least for me in this role, like that feels ever more present. Like we are watching the way in which history is being suppressed in this current effort to ban books. We're seeing, books on Ruby Bridges that are being challenged. We're watching books on Harvey Milk, books that talk about Harvey Milk as the first openly gay politician in California being challenged and banned. Like these are histories that are within the stories of this current movement. And you can imagine, as you kind of like, as you argue across a principled approach too, that it's slippy. Like if you're comfortable suppressing, some, but want to take a strong stand on others, you can see how maybe that would be held against. And then it's sort of just everybody, can begin to suppress and silence. And it's kind of, like of the moment, what is right or wrong.
Mhm.
There's somebody who is, gets to adjudicate on that. I agree. I think that's where we have, it's a slippy slope. Instead, how can we, expose and revisit history and parts of our history are heinous and awful. And there's language that's no longer appropriate today, was not appropriate then, but what can we glean from it? What can we learn? I think I think our mission just aligns to the answer is never to silence, but again, to have a real civic discourse where within the marketplace of ideas, how can we grow and evolve and kind of progress our thinking forward?
Yeah, I remember I did a series on journalism and the First Amendment and so forth a couple of years ago. And I remember asking one of the journalism professors about, well, how do you respond to, bad speech, right? Speech we don't like. And he said, well, the answer always is more speech, which I thought was such a,
It's true.
yeah,
Oh,
such a nice
yeah.
mantra, right? More speech, more speech.
Yeah, I think we see that a lot in the publishing industry too, right? Like when there's, critiques of, books that are talking about, like, well, let's just use the example of like Harper Lee, right? Like, oh, when you have white individuals talking about experiences of the historic experiences of Black individuals and Black communities, like, how can we it's not necessarily to remove the book, but like, how do we open up the opportunities for different voices to tell their own lived experiences? Like, how do we expand this marketplace to ensure that there's appropriate representation and that, people can offer works that are reflected in the author's lived experiences, as well as, having authors that are talking about experiences that may not be their own lived experience, but how do we offer, more and more and more of these opportunities? And presumably, you can imagine like the books that are strong will rise above, and they'll be just again. I guess there's there's a little bit of a capitalist draw here with this like marketplace idea, but
Mhm.
certainly I think that that's definitely part of it. It's like how do we just increase access for more individuals to be able to tell their stories, more individuals to contribute, and more speech.
Which again, you make a good point. If there's some book that's written, some obscure book that's written that somebody might find objectionable, that's actually not the book that gets banned. The book that gets banned is the one that draws some attention and, probably means that it has some widespread appeal, right? So yeah, it's
Oh
sort
my
of
gosh, I know. Well,
yeah.
we're always, sometimes we'll look at the list of banned books. I mean, there are so many that are blockbusters, which to me, I'm like, sometimes I don't even know how to make sense of that either, you know? Like you
Hmm.
have, when the movement first started, The Hate You Give was a predominantly challenged book. And, that book the book's incredible. It's so contemporary and of time. And also it was like a blockbuster hit that many people, can stream on their TVs. So the idea that like that, that book by Angie Thomas needs to be banned and censored. It's sometimes even these like blockbuster moments that you're like, wait, what? You're supposed to
Hmm.
read the book before you see the movie. Why would we be, removing access to the book here?
And again, the irony, right, that you can access the series with no problem at all. It's just if you were that interested student who wanted to go read the book behind the series, oops, not in your school library.
Right.
Yeah, there's something weird about that. I want to talk first about this issue of adjudication. And then,
Mhm.
as my dad would always say, well, who decides? And there's language that this movement uses people who are involved in this. They call books harmful or explicit or even pornography. So, can you explain who decides whether these books are pornographic or harmful or explicit?
Yeah, that's the right question. I mean, of course, when we think about harmful and explicit, we've also seen terms like sexually relevant,
Hmm.
books with sexual conduct. Like these are vague and highly subjective terms, and they're often not defined when there's policy or legislation that's put out around how would one categorize a book that is harmful. And I think we also recognize that when we have kind of blanket language like this, like how do we think about that across age and grade levels? Like how would we apply it, with recognition of author's authorial intent? Like how do we think about it in terms of what's developmentally appropriate, like what's harmful or age, inappropriate for a 5-year-old would be very different than what is it for a 15-year-old. So like when we see these terms, how do we interpret and apply them? And I think that's honestly, potentially it's intentional, right? And then I think what we have seen in terms of policy response to these terms is again this extreme caution where this language is being interpreted in an err on the side of heightened caution to remove books that anyone could deem as harmful or explicit without clarity of language. You mentioned obscenity, or maybe you mentioned pornography, but obscenity and pornography, those are terms that do have legal definitions, but it's quite a high bar to meet those. So when we see books being banned in schools, by no means are they obscene or pornographic by their legal definitions or colloquial definitions.
I see.
There's a lot of like sort of this vague and subjective terminology and also the use of language like pornographic, like obscenity that's being applied where books are being conflated to or mislabeled as something that they most certainly are not.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thanks for that. And we're going to talk more about the legal issues here in a second. But I did want to talk a little bit about booklooks.org. So, this is a website that I guess was started by a member of Moms for Liberty. And the website is a catalog of books that I guess would be considered for being banned. So, the website poses as information about these books that someone could go and research and decide if they want to have their own child have access to this book or if they want to raise an objection to this book through their school district or at the school board meetings and so forth. It's really interesting to look at this website. So the first thing that struck me when I went and looked at it was that it has a banner on it that says new editions, which looked so much like a publicity splash page for a publishing company, right? It was kind of funny. New editions, here we go, as to draw you in. And that one of the books that was included yesterday on new editions was Clockwork Orange, which is a book that was published in 1962. So it's interesting. The thing that I guess surprised me the most about this website was that what they've done is extract for each of the books that they catalog as being something for parents to consider or school districts to consider, is they've extracted from each of these books a summary of the objectionable sections, the excerpts, and they refer to this information as slick sheets. That actually gave me kind of a chill. And if you look at the slick sheets, it truly is an excerpt of pretty much things that are sexual in the book. So yeah, that gives you a slightly different perspective on what is being considered objectionable in these books. And also this term sexual conduct, that term keeps rising. And every time I see it, I think, are they talking about sexual content? But if you look at slick sheets, it really is anything sexual, even innuendo, right? Even things that are like subtle poetic gestures that might be interpreted as sensual in some way. It's a very different, it's very interesting to look at it from that perspective. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this whole thing from new editions to slick sheets.
We do keep our eyes on book looks, and when we mentioned earlier, we talked about how like lists are being shared, or like a book that's banned in one district is showing up on a banned book list in a district a state away. And book looks is one of these like online repositories that's, providing, the information for individual actors to go and challenge books in their own district or within, a nearby district. And there are several sites that look like this, and they kind of are a repository for challenge forms. And we'll see, there are examples where a book will be challenged and it'll be like, as if it was a physical copy that you could imagine being submitted, but it's almost as if like the book looks passage is like stapled to the challenge form. It's like challenging Clockwork Orange, reasons why, and it's just like the printout page from book looks. So there's a way in which this website is being used, nationwide to demonstrate how, to demonstrate that these books, and I'm putting this in quotes, are, sexually explicit. But I think what you point out is so essential. Book Looks is pulling excerpts of books that are passages taken way out of context, or visuals from graphic novels, again, without context of a book. When we think about kind of like the legal definition of obscenity, there's a test, a 3-part like Miller test that you go through. And if you meet the 3 parts of it, then it's possible that the material is obscene. But one of those tests is that a book has to be, or anything has to be taken in its wholeness. So when you're examining a book for its obscenity or for its sexual explicitness or whatever, kind of like a fundamental principle of that would be to review a book in its wholeness. And what Book Looks does is just, kind of remove that assessment at all, where there are, of course, there are passages taken out that when you read them alone, they are provocative. Like maybe you are like, oh, like that's, that's shocking, or that's interesting, or I didn't realize that was in Clockwork Orange, because as a reader, you're reading the whole book, from cover to cover. Like you're not focused on these like, sentences that when potentially you're reading them just kind of like flow with the story. They're offering something really specific, within the longer passage of the book. So I think that, has been part of this movement for sure. Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe is a graphic memoir manifesto, and there have been so many images that have just been held up to say this is porn, because it's a graphic novel. It's almost like reads like a comic book. There's images that you can take out of context, but when you read the whole graphic novel, you're like, oh, what? This is not titillating me. This is not, taken as a whole. This image is part of a person's story, is part of their telling of a life experience. And it's just been really like harmful to see the way books have been kind of pulled apart and taken out of context in this way to try and label them as something other than what they are.
Yeah, that is so interesting. I don't know if I can express this, but this idea of literature encompassing human experience. And hey, newsflash, all you listeners out there, look, sex is part of the human experience. Yeah, I know people driving in their cars. What? But what was funny to me was about Slick Sheets was it's almost like the 9-year-old kid who goes into a book that, they're not interested in reading, but they find the sex part, right? And so they tell their brothers and sisters, yeah, if you want the sex part, it's on page, 96 or whatever.
Yeah.
But and that is titillation, right? That there's a reason that the kid goes to that, but that is not literature. And so, yeah, this idea of slick sheets really flies in the face of literature and why we read and what literature means to us. So, yeah, it's very interesting to have this attitude of sort of pulling out excerpts and then flashing them in front of people. But new editions, here's more sex conduct, I guess, is what they're excerpting. And then posting that, as you say, I didn't realize that then the point was to download that and staple that to your objection, flash that in front of the authorities to see if you can get a rise out of them. So, yeah, very interesting approach to how you convince someone that something is pornographic or obscene. Okay, so let's talk about the legal issues behind that. And PEN America has joined a lawsuit about banned books. So tell us about the lawsuit and who your partners are in this lawsuit, and then in general, how you chose this particular case.
Yeah, so PEN America is part of, as you mentioned, kind of a first of its kind federal lawsuit against Escambia County School District. PEN America is one of several plaintiffs that include Penguin Random House, 5 authors whose works have been banned in the district, as well as parents and students of the district as well. So
who joined in with the lawsuit?
Oh, yes, exactly. So
okay.
As it stands right now, it's PEN America, Penguin Random House, 5 parents. I'm losing track at the current moment, and then students as well.
And this is in Florida.
In Florida, exactly. And then the authors include, the authors and children's book illustrator included in the lawsuit is Sarah Brennan, adult fiction authors David Levithan, George M. Johnson, Ashley Hope Perez, and then children's book author Kyle Lukoff. So those 5 authors are also serving as plaintiffs in the lawsuit.
Okay.
And so just early January, there was oral argument that was in response to a motion to dismiss the case. So we filed suit. There was a response from the district and the state to dismiss. And then the oral argument early in January was on whether the case would proceed or not. And the district judge there issued a ruling that the case would in fact proceed. And then we also heard that all plaintiffs in the case, so PEN America, Penguin Random House, the banned authors and parents, all have standing to pursue claims under First Amendment rights. And then importantly, the piece that stood out, I think, for many was that the judge also found that the state's argument, which was included in the motion to dismiss, that school districts' decisions to ban books are immune from the First Amendment. The judge found that argument has no merit. So I think that was a welcomed ruling and a win for PEN and Penguin Random House and authors and parents and students involved, and certainly, for many that are on the side of, really defending and fighting for the freedom to read.
So the defendants in this case are the school district and the state?
Yeah, the Escambia County School Board is the defendant.
And then I presume that the legislation in Florida, which banned discussions of gender and so forth in certain grades, is also part of this. Is that true? This alleged don't say gay legislation in Florida?
Since this suit has filed, Florida has then adopted legislation that took prior legislation, kind of combined it, and then extended it.
Oh.
The legislation in which we saw the district respond to, I should say, in removing the books, was the early Don't Say Gay legislation.
Okay.
That has then since been pulled into a larger piece of legislation that includes earlier provisions and then extends it as well.
Oh, okay.
Just in terms of legislation, the current active legislation is House Bill 1069. My understanding is that will not necessarily be addressed in this particular lawsuit, but I can imagine there are many groups that are thinking about how to push back against the current legislation that's active. Sometimes the legal stuff is tricky, but I think what we're optimistic for in this case in particular is that I think what's found in this case will have vast implications in how we think about book bans and the role in which state legislation can drive the removal of books from student access. So either way, I think there will be implications from this case that'll ripple out.
What's always so interesting to me about these cases is often how the courts, like Penn America, really understand the overarching principles of these things. And they don't get confused as the rest of us do as humans about, well, why? Yeah, why is that bad? Wait, I don't like this book. Yeah, I don't like that speech.
Exactly.
The courts often seem to be very clear. They really do seem to understand the First Amendment and, what it means, what freedom of expression truly means. So, yeah, it's always interesting to me that often as citizens, it's easy for us to get confused. But in a way, thank God for the courts because they understand these things certainly much better than I do. So tell us historically how courts have ruled on issues like this.
A lot of that is what's behind our case. And then there are other cases currently playing out across the country against book banning. So there's similar cases in Iowa to stop, a similar piece of legislation, almost like a copycat bill from Florida that was adopted in Iowa. There's ongoing litigation in Missouri. We're watching litigation in Texas. When you can connect them from state to state, all efforts to really maintain that book bans are unconstitutional. And that builds from different cases and different court systems and, different states. But, ultimately what we have seen and where there is precedent is that particularly precedent in schools is that school libraries and library books have special protections, that they are, they're constitutionally protected, and viewpoint discrimination that would remove a book is unconstitutional. So, that's really where our case in Escambia is really leaning into, sort of that precedent, that there are several examples of case law where the plaintiffs that have challenged a removal of a book from a school district because of, again, these narrow ideological viewpoints has been found unconstitutional. So we're optimistic that history is on our side here too. We, I think that's, and most people know that, like, we don't ban books, right? Like that's, even us non-lawyers, like I can understand we don't ban books. That's undemocratic. It's, unconstitutional.
So you feel as though precedence is on your side here.
We sure hope so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. I want to close with a quote from Suzanne Nossel, who's the CEO of Penn America. She says, "Those who are bent on the suppression of stories and ideas are turning our schools into battlegrounds, compounding post-pandemic learning loss, driving teachers out of the classroom, and denying the joy of reading to our kids. By depriving a rising generation of the freedom to read, these bans are eating away at the foundations of our democracy." Interesting idea that through the courts is where we continue to establish these foundations of our democracy, including through legal action, such as the one that's been taken by Penn America. So Casey, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And before I let you go, is there anything that you'd like to share with the audience, a website, call to action? This is your time.
I often think about our efforts to defend the freedoms to read across and the freedoms to learn across several spheres, right? We talked about we're going to fight them in the courts. We have, ongoing litigation, but there's so many other ways that folks can get involved. So we're also watching legislation being proposed on both sides of this issue. So legislation that, may influence this movement and have censorial effects, as well as legislation that's really defending the right to read and maintaining the value and the importance of access to school libraries and school library books. So for listeners, contact your legislator, follow your legislative session, see what's going on. And if you're not a policy person, that's cool. There's lots of other ways. I think our third strand is just around kind of like raising awareness to activate the public. So this can be something more local, like visiting your school board or your local library, reading a banned book and maybe, sitting with it and challenging why this book would be removed and why people would find it, inappropriate or harmful or obscene or insert word. So, lots of different ways. Supporting authors whose works have been banned, supporting students who are out there kind of frontline defenders of the right to read. And so for more information, you can always visit PEN America's website. We have an action page for our opposition to book bans and different calls to action. And you could find that at www.pen.org/action, ACTION. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for having me on today too.
Oh, it was lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to explore such complicated topics with us. You did a marvelous job, and thank you for the work that you do. And thanks to PEN America also. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course. And thank you for elevating. I mean, it is, I don't want to overstate or understate, but a lot of people are really feeling this and seeing the way in which is kind of like an issue of today to really be a part of and to stand up for, and that history never looks kindly on those that ban books. So I think we could all mobilize together to oppose, further banning of books here.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you for listening. Our goal in 2024 is to expand our audience because we get such great guests. So we'd love your help in spreading the word by sharing, subscribing, liking, thumbs-upping, rating, and commenting. Got all that? Really, thanks for any support. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by Discreet Guide, the training company for improving your speaking and writing skills. Also, a shout out to Podomatic, our podcast hosting platform. You podcasters out there might want to check them out. They've been good to us. And finally, thanks to Quincas Morera for the theme music.